When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, the first assumption most people make is painfully simple. They don't care. But that assumption is not only inaccurate, it's the very thing that deepens the disconnect. What looks like indifference on the surface is often a deeply ingrained self-protection mechanism operating beneath awareness. Avoidant individuals are not wired to reject love, they are wired to regulate emotional intensity by creating distance. And that distinction matters, because if you misinterpret distance as rejection, you respond with pressure, and pressure is precisely what reinforces their need to withdraw. You end up feeding the very pattern you're trying to stop. Now, think about what happens when life gets busy. Stress increases, cognitive load rises, emotional bandwidth shrinks. For most people, that might mean leaning on connection for support. But for someone avoidant, the internal equation is different. Busyness becomes a signal not to reach out, but to simplify. And the quickest way to simplify their internal world is to reduce emotional demands. That often means pulling back from the very person they care about. This isn't because the relationship lacks value. It's because closeness, especially during stress, can feel like an additional responsibility rather than a source of relief. There's a subtle but powerful belief operating here. If I get too close, I might lose control of my independence, my time, or even myself. So distance becomes a way of maintaining equilibrium. And here's where it gets even more nuanced. Many avoidant individuals are not consciously thinking, I need to push this person away. Instead, they feel a vague sense of overwhelm or irritation, and their behavior follows that feeling. They might tell themselves they just need space, or that they're too busy, without fully recognizing the emotional pattern driving that decision. From the outside, it looks intentional. From the inside, it feels necessary. If you approach this dynamic assuming a lack of care, your response will naturally lean toward confrontation or emotional urgency. You'll want reassurance. You'll want clarity. You'll want closeness to prove the bond is still intact. But to an avoidant person, that energy doesn't feel like love, it feels like pressure. And pressure activates their instinct to retreat even further. So the real shift begins when you stop asking, why don't they care? And start asking, what are they protecting? Because once you understand that their withdrawal is about self-regulation, not rejection, your entire approach changes. You stop personalizing the distance and you start responding with intention instead of reaction. This doesn't mean tolerating neglect or abandoning your own needs. It means recognizing the deeper pattern at play so you can break the cycle instead of reinforcing it. Because the truth is, avoidants don't need less love, they need a different experience of love. One that doesn't feel like a loss of freedom, but a gain in safety. And when you truly understand that, you stop chasing proof of their feelings and start becoming the kind of presence that makes closeness feel safe again. Because the moment you stop misreading distance as indifference is the moment you begin to transform it into connection. Once you begin to understand that their distance is not a lack of care, but a form of self-regulation, the next layer becomes even clearer, and this is where most people get it wrong. Busyness in the life of an avoidant is not just circumstance. It becomes strategy. On the surface, it looks completely reasonable. They're working longer hours, handling responsibilities, managing pressure. And to be fair, those things are real. But psychologically, something deeper is happening. Busyness becomes an emotional escape hatch, a socially acceptable way to create distance without having to confront the discomfort of vulnerability. Because here's the truth. It's much easier to say I'm busy than it is to say I feel overwhelmed by closeness, or I don't know how to stay connected without losing my sense of control. One is practical. The other requires emotional exposure. And avoidant individuals are wired to minimize that exposure whenever possible. So instead of directly engaging with emotional needs, yours or even their own, they redirect their energy into tasks, goals, and distractions. Work becomes predictable. It has structure, clear expectations, and measurable outcomes. Relationships, on the other hand, are fluid. They require presence, responsiveness, and emotional availability. For someone who associates closeness with pressure, that unpredictability can feel threatening. Now, this doesn't mean they're consciously choosing work over you in a calculated way. It's more subtle than that. Their nervous system is constantly scanning for ways to reduce emotional intensity. And when life gets demanding, the path of least resistance is to double down on what feels controllable. Productivity becomes a refuge. You might notice patterns like delayed responses, shorter conversations, or a gradual fading of emotional engagement. And again, the instinct is to interpret this as disinterest. But what's really happening is a shift in where they feel safest investing their energy. It's not that they value you less, it's that they feel more in control elsewhere. And here's where the dynamic becomes self-reinforcing. The more they lean into busyness, the more disconnected the relationship feels. The more disconnected it feels, the more likely you are to reach out with urgency, seeking reassurance or clarity. And that urgency, no matter how justified, can feel like an added demand on someone who already feels stretched. So they retreat further into the one place where expectations feel manageable, their work, their tasks, their independence. It becomes a loop. Busyness creates distance. Distance creates anxiety. Anxiety creates pursuit. Pursuit creates pressure. And pressure drives them back into busyness. Breaking this cycle requires a fundamental shift in perception. You have to stop competing with their schedule and start understanding what their schedule represents. It's not just about time, it's about emotional safety. If you try to win against their busyness by demanding more attention, you'll lose every time. Not because you're asking for too much, but because you're asking in a way that triggers their defenses. The more effective approach is to remove the association between connection and pressure. When interaction feels light, grounded, and free of expectation, it no longer competes with their need for control. It complements it. And over time, that changes the internal equation. Connection stops feeling like a liability and starts becoming a place of ease. This is not about ignoring your needs or settling for crumbs. It's about understanding the psychology well enough to change the pattern at its root. Because when you stop reacting to their busyness as rejection, you stop feeding the cycle that keeps you both stuck. And when busyness is no longer an escape, it loses its power to create distance. Once you recognize that busyness can function as an emotional escape, you can use it as a way to cope with stress and anxiety. The instinctive reaction is to close the gap, to reach in, to restore connection, to bring things back to what they were. And on the surface, that impulse makes complete sense. Human beings are wired for connection. And when that connection feels threatened, we move toward it. But in this dynamic, the very thing that feels natural to you often produces the exact opposite result. Because when you chase an avoidant, you're not just moving toward them, you're increasing the emotional intensity of the moment. And for someone who already feels overwhelmed by closeness, that increase doesn't register as love. It registers as pressure. Now, pressure doesn't always come in obvious forms. It's not just demands or ultimatums. It can show up as repeated texts, the need for constant reassurance, subtle emotional cues that say, I need you to respond so I can feel okay. Even well-intentioned conversations about where this is going can carry an undercurrent of urgency that an avoidant person picks up on immediately. And here's the paradox. The more you try to secure the connection through pursuit, the more you destabilize it. Because what you're really doing without realizing it is confirming their deepest fear. That closeness will eventually come with expectations they can't meet or demands that will overwhelm them. So their system responds the only way it knows how. By creating distance. You might notice that the more you reach out, the longer they take to respond. The more you ask for clarity, the more vague they become. It feels like you're losing them in real time, and your instinct is to try harder. But that effort, that emotional intensity, is exactly what accelerates their withdrawal. This is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of a mismatch in how emotional safety is experienced. For you, safety might come from closeness, communication, reassurance. For them, safety comes from space, autonomy, and the absence of pressure. So when you increase one, they instinctively move to restore the other. Think of it like a psychological pendulum. The harder you push in one direction, the stronger the swing in the opposite direction. And if you don't understand the mechanics, You end up exhausting yourself, wondering why nothing you do seems to bring them closer. But here's where awareness changes everything. When you see that chasing is not connection, it's escalation, you gain the ability to shift your approach. You stop trying to force a response and start regulating your own emotional energy. You create steadiness instead of urgency. And that steadiness does something powerful. It removes the perceived threat, because an avoidant doesn't move closer when they feel pursued. They move closer when they feel unpressured, when there's room to breathe, to choose, to engage without the fear of being pulled in too fast or too deeply. And that doesn't mean withdrawing in a reactive or passive-aggressive way. It means stepping back with intention, grounded in self-respect rather than fear. This is where most people struggle, because it requires you to tolerate uncertainty, to resist the urge to fix the moment, to trust that connection doesn't need to be forced to be real. But when you can do that, you interrupt the cycle. You stop feeding the dynamic that keeps both of you stuck in opposing roles, one pursuing, the other distancing. And in that space, something shifts. The absence of pressure creates the possibility of curiosity. The distance that once felt like disconnection starts to soften into something else, a chance for them to re-engage on their own terms. Because the truth is simple, even if it's not easy, the more you chase, the further they run. But the moment you stop chasing is the moment they finally have the space to turn back. So once you understand that chasing intensifies the very distance you're trying to close, the next question becomes, what actually works? And this is where the concept of space is often misunderstood, because when people here give them space, they interpret it as withdrawal, silence, or even a kind of emotional punishment. But that's not what creates reconnection. In fact, reactive silence, where you pull back out of frustration or hurt, carries the same emotional charge as chasing. It's just expressed differently. What we're talking about here is something far more intentional. It's not distance rooted in fear. It's space rooted in self-control. There's a difference between absence and presence without pressure. And that distinction is everything. When your silence is heavy, when it's loaded with expectation, let's see if they notice. Let's see if they come back. It doesn't feel safe. It feels like a test. And avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to anything that feels like a demand, even if it's unspoken. But when your space is clean, when it's not trying to manipulate an outcome, when it's simply an expression of your own stability, it does something powerful. It removes the emotional intensity that was triggering their withdrawal in the first place. It gives the relationship room to breathe. Think about what happens internally for someone avoidant when the pressure disappears. There's no longer a sense that they're being pulled, evaluated, or expected to perform emotionally on demand. And in that absence of pressure, their nervous system begins to settle. The very thing they were defending against is no longer present. Now, this doesn't mean they immediately come rushing back. That's where patience becomes critical. Because what you're doing is not forcing a reaction, you're changing the conditions under which connection can naturally reemerge. And here's the deeper psychological shift. When you stop reacting, you become unpredictable in a way that breaks the pattern. If they're used to you pursuing when they pull away, your calm consistency stands out. It creates a subtle contrast, not as a tactic, but as a new emotional reality. And that contrast invites curiosity. They may begin to wonder, why does this feel different? And that question alone opens a door that pressure would have kept closed. At the same time, this kind of space centers you. Instead of being consumed by their behavior, waiting for a message, analyzing every delay, you return to your own life, your own rhythm, your own sense of self. And that's not just healthy for you, it's essential for the dynamic. Because attraction, especially with avoidant individuals, is deeply connected to autonomy. The more grounded and self-contained you are, the safer it feels for them to move towards you. But let's be clear, this is not about disappearing or pretending you don't care. It's about engaging from a place of emotional independence rather than emotional urgency. When you do connect, it's calm, it's present, and it's free of hidden demands. You're not trying to extract reassurance. You're simply allowing interaction to unfold. And over time, that consistency builds something that pressure never could. Trust. Not the kind that comes from constant closeness, but the kind that comes from knowing connection doesn't come at the cost of freedom. This is how the dynamic begins to reset. Not through force, not through strategy, but through a shift in emotional posture. You stop trying to control the distance, and instead, you create an environment where closeness no longer feels threatening. Because in the end, it's not your presence that pushes them away, it's the pressure attached to it. And the moment your presence feels like peace instead of pressure is the moment distance begins to disappear. As you begin to create space in a way that removes pressure, something important starts to shift, but it only holds if you understand what actually allows an avoidant person to move closer. And that is emotional safety. Not control, not persuasion, not perfectly timed words. Safety. Now, emotional safety is often misunderstood because people assume it means being endlessly accommodating or suppressing their own needs to keep the peace. That's not safety, that's self-abandonment. Real emotional safety is the absence of threat. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, the threat is not conflict itself. It's the fear of being overwhelmed, consumed, or expected to meet emotional demands they don't feel equipped to handle. So when you try to control the relationship, when you push for clarity, push for consistency, push for reassurance, you may believe you're strengthening the bond. But what they experience is a narrowing of space, a sense that the relationship is becoming something they can't regulate on their own terms. And the moment that feeling appears, their instinct is to restore balance by stepping back. This is why control, even when it's subtle, becomes counterproductive. Doesn't create stability, it creates resistance. Emotional safety, on the other hand, communicates something entirely different. It says, you can be here without losing yourself. It says, connection doesn't come with a hidden cost. And most importantly, it removes the fear that closeness will escalate into pressure. How do you create that? Not through words alone, but through consistency of behavior. You respond instead of react. You express instead of demand. You allow space without attaching meaning to it. And when you do communicate your needs, you do it from a place of grounded clarity, not emotional urgency. For example, there's a profound difference between saying, why haven't you been calling me? Do you even care? And saying, I enjoy talking with you and I feel more connected when we stay in touch regularly. The first creates defensiveness. The second creates awareness without pressure. One demands a response, the other invites it. And that distinction is where safety is built. Because when someone doesn't feel attacked, evaluated, or cornered, they're far more likely to stay present. They don't need to retreat to protect themselves. They can remain engaged without feeling like they're being pulled into something they can't control. Now, this doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally expressive or perfectly consistent. That's not the goal. The goal is to create an environment where their natural defenses are no longer constantly activated. And when those defenses lower, even slightly, you begin to see moments of openness that weren't there before. Small shifts, longer conversations, more voluntary engagement. These are signals not of transformation overnight, but of trust beginning to form. And trust in this context is not built through intensity. It's built through predictability, through knowing that interaction with you will not lead to overwhelm. That closeness will not be followed by pressure, that they can approach without the fear of being pulled further than they're ready to go. At the same time, you remain anchored in your own standards. You're not tolerating inconsistency indefinitely. You're simply choosing to communicate in a way that keeps the door open rather than slamming it shut. You're replacing force with influence. Because ultimately, people don't open up because they're told to. They open up because it feels safe enough to do so. And when you shift from trying to control their behavior to creating a space where they no longer feel the need to defend against you, something fundamental changes. The relationship stops being a source of tension and starts becoming a place of ease. Because the truth is, you cannot force someone to come closer, but you can become the reason they no longer feel the need to stay away. And the moment they feel safe enough to stay, is the moment real connection begins. When you begin to prioritize emotional safety over control, the entire dynamic starts to reorganize itself. But to truly deepen love with someone who has avoidant tendencies, you need to be willing to confront and work through those issues. There's one final shift that brings everything together, and that is learning the art of balance. Not intensity, not sacrifice, not force, balance. Because one of the biggest misconceptions in relationships is the idea that love must be proven through constant closeness, constant communication, constant emotional presence. That model might feel natural to some, but to an avoidant, it feels like a slow erosion of autonomy. And the moment love starts to feel like a loss of self, their instinct is to create distance to restore it. So the goal is not to pull them into your rhythm, nor to completely adapt to theirs. It's to create a shared space where both connection and independence can coexist without threatening each other. This is where maturity in relationships truly reveals itself. Can you stay connected without becoming dependent? Can you care deeply without needing constant reassurance? Can you allow space without interpreting it as loss? These are not just relationship skills, they are indicators of emotional self-sufficiency. Because when you rely on the other person to regulate your sense of security, every shift in their behavior feels destabilizing. You're no longer engaging from a place of choice, you're reacting from a place of need. And that need, however valid it may feel, often becomes the very pressure that pushes an avoidant further away. Balance changes that equation. It means you have a full life outside the relationship, you own goals, your own focus, your own sense of direction. Not as a strategy to make them chase you, but as a reflection of who you are. And that independence does something powerful. It removes the weight from the relationship. It allows connection to exist without carrying the burden of fulfilling every emotional need. At the same time, balance doesn't mean emotional detachment. It doesn't mean becoming unavailable or indifferent. It means you show up fully when you're present. You engage with clarity, warmth, and intention, but without overextending yourself or losing your center in the process. This creates a new kind of dynamic, one where closeness is chosen, not demanded, where interaction feels natural, not obligatory. And for someone avoidant, that distinction is critical, because when they feel they have the freedom to move towards you rather than being pulled, their resistance begins to soften. And here's the paradox. The less you try to force closeness, the more space there is for it to grow organically, because you're no longer operating from fear of losing them. You're operating from a grounded sense of self that doesn't depend on their constant validation. Over time, this balance becomes magnetic, not in a manipulative sense, but in a deeply human one. People are drawn to those who are both connected and self-contained. It signals stability. It signals strength. And most importantly, it signals that being close to you does not come at the cost of their own identity. Now, will this guarantee that every avoidant person suddenly transforms into an openly expressive partner? Number. And that's an important reality to accept. This is not about changing who they are, it's about changing the dynamic you participate in. And in doing so, you give the relationship the best possible conditions to evolve. Because love at its core is not something that can be forced into existence or sustained through pressure. It thrives in an environment where both people feel free to be themselves while still choosing each other. And when you reach that point, when you no longer feel the need to chase, control, or prove you step into a different kind of power, a quiet confidence that doesn't demand closeness, but naturally invites it. Because the deepest form of love is not built by holding on tighter, but by creating a connection strong enough that neither of you feels the need to pull away. So when you step back and look at the entire pattern, what once felt confusing starts to make sense. The distance was never about a lack of care. The busyness was never just about time. The withdrawal was never random. It was a system predictable, reactive, and deeply rooted in the need for emotional safety. And the moment you understand that, you stop fighting the wrong battle. You stop chasing because you realize pursuit creates pressure, You stop personalizing distance because you see it as self-protection. You stop trying to control the outcome because you understand that control creates resistance. Instead, you shift. You become grounded where you were once reactive. You create space where there was once urgency. You communicate with clarity instead of demand. And most importantly, you build a life and identity that doesn't depend on someone else's consistency to feel secure. And in doing that, you don't just change the relationship, you change the dynamic entirely. Because now, connection is no longer something you're trying to force. It's something that has room to breathe. It's something that can grow without pressure, deepen without fear, and stabilize without constant reassurance. Will every avoidant person meet you in that space? Number. And that truth matters. Because real power is not just in understanding others, it's in knowing when a dynamic can evolve and when it cannot. But when it can, it happens in a way that feels completely different from what most people expect. It's quieter. It's steadier. It's not built on intensity, but on consistency. Not on chasing, but on choosing. So the real question is no longer, how do I make them stop pulling away? The real question becomes, can I show up in a way that makes closeness feel safe, natural, and free? Because when you do that, you're no longer trying to hold the relationship together. You're creating the conditions where it no longer wants to fall apart.